The day life in the Middle Ages in England became unsustainable and people faced brutal reality. Imagine if the very ground beneath your feet, the soil you have bled for across generations, suddenly stopped recognizing your touch. What happens when the sky remains a bruised iron gray for months, refusing to grant the sun's warmth to the seeds you've buried with such desperation? Can a society built on the rigid stone of hierarchy survive when the bread that fuels its servants simply vanishes from the earth? Have you ever felt the precise moment when a civilization's golden age of silently stable fractures into 1,000 jagged pieces? How thin is the veil between a functioning kingdom and a landscape of pure, unadulterated survival? You have been taught to see the medieval era as a tapestry of chivalry and stone fortresses, but the truth is found in the smell of damp wool and the sound of a stomach that has forgotten the weight of grain. This journey will not lead you to the polished halls of kings, but to the cold, muddy reality of a world that pushed its environment until the environment pushed back with a violence no sword could parry. By the end of this account, you will understand that history is not made by the grand speeches of lords, but by the breaking point of the common man's endurance and the fragility of a system that forgot its own limits. You are walking now through a village in the English Midlands, late in the 14th century. The air is thick, saturated with a moisture that clings to your lungs like a wet shroud. The ground is no longer a path, it is a slurry of black mud and animal waste that threatens to pull the leather from your feet with every step. Listen to the silence. It is not the peaceful stillness of the countryside, but a heavy, expectant stillness where the birds have ceased to sing because there is nothing left for them to glean from the fields. The light is filtered through a perpetual mist, casting everything in shades of slate and charcoal. You feel the texture of the wattle and daub walls of the huts, rough, cold, and crumbling under the relentless rain. This was the structure of life: wood, straw, and earth. But the earth is saturated. The wood is rotting from within. The very materials that provided shelter are now the agents of decay. In the fields, the rye and barley are flattened, drowned in their furrows. You can see the peasants standing at the edge of the commons, their faces etched with a fatigue that transcends mere tiredness. It is the look of a soul realizing that the traditional prayers and the traditional titles are no longer buying the traditional protection of the heavens. The feudal contract was simple: you labor, the Lord protects, and God provides. But as the rain falls for the third consecutive week in the middle of July, that contract is dissolving in the runoff. The stability of the manor, once thought to be as eternal as the stars, is proving to be as fleeting as the summer heat. This is the first crack in the foundation, the realization that the old ways are no longer sustainable. The abundance of the past century, which saw populations boom and forests cleared, has hit a wall of ecological exhaustion. The soil is tired, stripped of its nutrients by centuries of the same crops, and now the climate has turned. You feel the shift in the wind, a biting edge that speaks of a cooling world. This is not just a bad season, it is the beginning of a brutal reality that will redefine what it means to be human in a world that has suddenly become hostile. The sensory experience is one of encroaching dampness, the smell of mold in the thatch, the taste of watered down ale that provides no sustenance, the sight of a horizon that offers no hope of a clearing. You are an observer of a slow motion collapse, where every link in the chain of survival is being pulled to its absolute limit. Before we descend further into the mechanics of this unraveling world, you must realize that this story is your own history, a mirror to how we handle the end of our own certainties. Make sure you are already subscribed to this channel, as here we explore the depths of the human experience with the seriousness that history demands, ensuring that you never again see the past as just a handful of dates in a dusty book, but as a living lesson in survival. Feel the suction of the earth, a persistent rhythmic pull that demands an immense expenditure of energy for every inch of progress across the open landscape. This is the geometry of survival, where the long, narrow strips of land allocated to each family represent the thin line between a winter of quiet desperation and a spring that never arrives. Notice the texture of the tools in the hands of the men around you. Heavy, wrought iron plowshares that are pitted with rust and worn smooth by decades of friction against the abrasive grit of the stones. The wood of the plow is dark, stained by sweat and the oils of human skin, polished not by intention, but by the sheer repetition of a labor that knows no end. You can hear the low, guttural grunts of the oxen, their breath blooming in the damp air like ghosts of steam, their massive bodies straining against the yokes that creak and groan under the tension of the heavy earth. This is the sound of a kingdom's engine, a biological machine that is slowly running out of fuel as the fodder for the animals becomes as scarce as the grain for the people. The atmosphere is thick with the scent of wet fur, turned earth, and the faint metallic tang of the coming frost. You see the contrast now, the high stone walls of the manor house rising in the distance, a fortress of relative stability where the hearts are still fed with seasoned oak, and the cellars still hold the remnants of better years. But here, in the commons, the abundance of the past century has evaporated, leaving behind a stark skeletal reality where every calorie is counted and every hour of sunlight is a precious commodity. The peasants work with a mechanical efficiency, their movements dictated by a necessity so ancient it has become instinctual, yet their eyes betray a growing awareness of a systemic failure. The land is no longer yielding its bounty, the nitrogen has been bled from the fields by generations of overfarming, and the weather has turned into a chaotic, unpredictable enemy that mocks the traditional calendars of the church. You observe the children, small shadows moving through the tall, damp grass of the margins, scavenging for acorns or the bitter berries of the hedgerow, their bellies beginning to distend from a diet of nothing but chaff and hope. The fragility of the system is no longer a theoretical concern discussed in the universities of Oxford or Paris. It is a physical sensation, a coldness that starts in the marrow of the bones and refuses to be dislodged by the meager fires of the evening. The transition from a society of growth to one of managed decline is happening in the very rhythm of the village, in the way the blacksmith looks at his dwindling coal and the way the miller guards the precious, dusty remains of the last harvest. There is a tension in the air, a vibration of communal anxiety that hums beneath the surface of daily life, waiting for the one final blow that will shatter the illusion of feudal security forever. As you watch the sun dip behind a bank of leaden clouds, casting long, distorted shadows across the broken furrows, you realize that the social contract is being rewritten by the hand of starvation. The loyalty to the Lord is fading as the Lord's ability to provide the basic safety of a full stomach disappears into the mud of a ruined autumn. It is a moment of profound, wordless realization for every soul in this valley. The old world is dying, and the new one is being born in the ruins of the sustainable dream. Now, type in the comments the phrase, "The earth demands what was taken from it," to show that you understand how the balance between man and nature is the foundation of our entire existence. The architecture of fragility is not built of stone or grand designs, but of the porous boundaries between a human body and the unforgiving elements of the English wilderness. Step inside the threshold of a peasant's cruck frame cottage and feel the immediate shift in the sensory landscape, where the air is no longer just wet, but thick with the acrid, stinging ghost of peat smoke that never truly leaves the lungs. There are no chimneys here to channel the fire's breath. Instead, the smoke curls lazily toward the blackened thatch of the roof, seeking exit through the gaps in the straw, coating every surface in a fine, greasy layer of soot that tastes of carbon and ancient earth. You can feel the floor beneath your feet, not wood or tile, but hard-packed dirt mixed with oxblood and straw, a cold, damp slab that leaches the heat from your limbs through the thin soles of your shoes. This is the interior of the medieval reality, a space where the concept of privacy is a luxury of the future, and the proximity of bodies is the only reliable source of warmth. Listen to the rhythmic, wet cough of an elder in the corner, a sound that resonates through the thin wattle walls, a testament to the respiratory toll of a life spent in the damp. The texture of existence is found in the rough linen of the tunic against your skin, a fabric that is never truly dry, and the heavy woolen cloak that smells of sheep and rain, stiffening as the temperature outside begins its nightly descent toward freezing. You see the flickering light of a single tallow candle, its flames struggling against the drafts that whistle through the gaps in the doorframe, casting distorted, dancing shadows that make the small room feel like a cavern of uncertainty. In this space, the contrast between the stability of the cathedral's masonry and the precariousness of this hovel is a physical ache. Every element of this structure was designed for a world where the seasons followed a predictable cycle, but now, as the Great Famine begins to tighten its grip across the shires, the house feels less like a shelter and its walls more like a trap. The functional necessity of the hearth, once the center of communal storytelling and shared meals, has become a place of rationing and silence, watchful hunger. You notice how the tools of daily life, the wooden bowls, the iron pot, the spinning wheel, are handled with a desperate, reverent care, for there is no surplus to replace them if they should break in this era of scarcity. The organization of the household is failing because the inputs of the forest and the field are being choked off by royal decrees and the sheer exhaustion of the landscape. The wood for the fire is green and hissing, for the dry timber has long since been scavenged, and the smoke it produces is a thick, blinding fog that stings the eyes and clouds the mind. This is the breaking of the domestic spirit, the point where the sanctuary of the home becomes a testament to the impossibility of the current way of life. The very air you breathe is a reminder of the fragility of the lungs and the strength of the winter, a silent battle being fought in every cottage from Cornwall to Northumbria. As you sit in the dim, flickering orange light, watching the steam rise from your own damp clothing, you realize that the grandeur of the Middle Ages was always balanced on this knife edge of structural vulnerability. The transition from a society that builds to a society that merely huddles is almost complete, and the weight of the coming darkness is felt in the silence of the hungry children and the stillness of the empty grain bin. Enjoy this video now to honor the resilience of those who face the absolute cold so that the human lineage could reach this day, as each click is an acknowledgement of the strength we inherited. The breaking point arrives not with a thunderclap, but with the steady, rhythmic drumming of a rain that refuses to cease until the very concept of dry earth becomes a distant, taunting memory. Step out from the smoky hovel and witness the structural collapse of a landscape that has reached its absolute limit, where the drainage ditches of the open fields have turned into stagnant black veins of rot. You can feel the change in the atmosphere, a sudden, sharp drop in the density of the air as the prevailing winds shift, bringing a cold that does not just chill the skin, but seems to crystallize the very fluid in your joints. This is the Great Famine of the early 14th century, a period where the precarious balance of English feudalism was finally tipped into the abyss of a brutal, unyielding reality. Observe the grain in the barns. It is no longer golden and life-giving, but a damp, sprouting mass of gray fungus and mold that smells of fermentation and death. The functional necessity of the harvest, the single heartbeat of the medieval world, has skipped, and the silence that follows is the sound of a civilization's gears grinding to a halt. You see the horses, once the pride of the local bailiff, their ribs protruding like the hull of a shipwrecked vessel, their eyes clouded with the same listless despair that mirrors the faces of the village elders. There is a terrifying transparency to the social order now. The guards at the granary doors are no longer protecting the community's future, but the hoarding of a few, and the thin veneer of legal stability is stretching until it becomes translucent. The texture of the roads has transformed into a treacherous, knee-deep sludge that isolates every hamlet, turning the kingdom into a collection of desperate islands where the only currency left is a handful of withered peas. You are witnessing the moment when the abundance of the High Middle Ages is revealed as a fragile loan from a nature that has now come to collect its debt with interest. The contrast is no longer between rich and poor, but between those who have a week of life left in their larders and those who have only hours. This is the shattering of the great chain of being, where the peasant begins to look at the Lord, not with reverence, but with the cold, calculating hunger of a wolf. The sensory decay is everywhere. The taste of bread stretched with ground sawdust and bark. The sight of a church bell that remains silent because the sexton is too weak to pull the rope. The sound of the wind howling through the ribs of unfinished cathedrals. Every element of this society, from the titles of the priest to the labor of the serf, was predicated on a surplus that has vanished into the mud. You feel the weight of this historical pivot, the realization that the old ways of organizing human effort are being systematically dismantled by the sheer weight of a cooling planet. The fragility of the agrarian dream is laid bare, and as you watch a mother divide a single turnip among 4 children, the reality of what it means to be unsustainable becomes a physical pain in your chest. The organization of the manor is dissolving into a chaotic scramble for the margins, where the law of the land is being replaced by the law of the empty stomach. Share this documentary with someone who needs to understand that civilization is just a thin veil over wild nature, and that knowledge of history is our only safeguard against repeating the same mistakes that led this world to total collapse. Walk through the narrow, winding lanes of a village that has passed its breaking point and feel the oppressive weight of an atmosphere that has lost its vitality. The light here is different now. It is a jaundiced, filtered yellow that seems to cling to the damp stone of the church and the fraying edges of the thatched roofs. You can hear the sound of the wind, but it no longer carries the lowing of cattle or the rhythmic thud of the flail. It is a hollow, whistling moan that vibrates through the empty granaries, a flute played by the void where the harvest should be. Touch the surface of a wooden door in the village center. It is slimy with a film of algae and neglected mold, the iron hinges weeping streaks of orange rust that look like dried tears against the blackened oak. This is the disintegration of the functional world, where the maintenance of the environment has been abandoned for the singular, desperate focus on the next breath. You see the contrast in the very movement of the people. They no longer walk with the purposeful stride of the laborer, but move with a fluid, ghostly lethargy, their limbs heavy with the edema of malnutrition. The textures of the world have become hostile. The grass is no longer fodder, but a coarse, indigestible carpet. The water in the wells is no longer a life spring, but a dark, stagnant mirror reflecting a sky that offers no reprieve. In the cities, the density of human life has become a liability, as the waste of thousands overflows the gutters and seeps into the foundations of the timbered houses, creating a breeding ground for a shadow that has not yet been named, but is already felt in the fevered dreams of the dying. You are observing the ultimate vulnerability of a specialized society. When the producers of grain can no longer produce, the artisans, the priests, and the soldiers become atmospheric ghosts, haunting the structures they once animated. The rhythm of the bells, which once dictated the hours of prayer and work, now tolls only for the passing of the nameless. A constant metallic reminder that the social organism is failing from the limbs upward to the heart. The internal organization of the family, the smallest unit of this medieval universe, is fraying as the instinct to protect one's own clashes with the impossibility of dividing anything by 5. You feel the grit of the dust in your teeth, not the dust of the field, but the dust of a crumbling civilization that is being ground down by the slow, inexorable gears of an ecological trap. The stability of the 1,000-year-old dream of a Christian empire is being dissolved by the simple, brutal reality of a planet that has grown cold and a soil that has grown silent. Every sensory detail, from the cold sweat on a child's brow to the silence of the village forge, is a chapter in the ledger of a world that lived beyond its means and is now being forced to settle the account in the most intimate currency of all. The transition from the concrete misery of the mud to the elevation of a new, battle-hardened human consciousness is the final, most enduring layer of this medieval collapse. Stand now at the edge of a village that has seen its population halved, where the silence is no longer a sign of death, but the heavy, pressurized stillness of a vacuum waiting to be filled. Can you feel the subtle shift in the vibration of the air as the survivors begin to stand taller, their spines stiffening with a realization that the old, rigid hierarchies were as combustible as dry straw? What happens to the soul of a peasant when he realizes the Lord's castle could not keep out the rain, nor could the bishop's prayers mend the blighted wheat? You are breathing in the scent of wood smoke once more, but this time it is different. It is the smell of clearing, of old, rotted structures being burned to make way for a necessity that knows no master. The texture of the world is changing from the soft, yielding dampness of submission to the jagged, hard-edged reality of a labor force that has suddenly become precious because it is scarce. You see the survivors moving through the commons, their hands calloused not just by the plow, but by the sheer friction of resisting a fate that tried to erase them. The contrast is now absolute. The stability of the past was a beautiful, static lie, while the current fragility is a dynamic, terrifying truth that demands a new way of existing. The functional organization of England is rearranging itself before your very eyes as the survivors refuse to return to the old rents and the old tethers, sensing that the day life became unsustainable was also the day the chains of the mind began to rust away. The sensory experience of this moment is one of cold, clear light, a winter sun that reveals every crack in the stone and every rib in the body, stripped of the romantic illusions of the age of growth. You feel the weight of a historical significance that transcends the local valley. This is the birth of an individual agency forged in the furnace of a systemic breakdown. The architecture of the future is being imagined in the ruins of the hovels, built on a foundation of skepticism and the visceral knowledge that nature does not negotiate with social status. The abundance that was once taken for granted is being replaced by a calculated, fierce protection of resources, a social and philosophical elevation that views the earth not as an infinite servant, but as a volatile partner. As you watch the first green shoots of a harder rye pierce through the scarred earth of the following spring, you realize that the brutal reality faced by these people was the necessary fire that tempered the modern world. The meaning of this collapse is not found in the tragedy of the lost, but in the terrifyingly beautiful resilience of those who looked into the abyss of an unsustainable life and chose to rebuild from the blackened soil up. Every element of their struggle, from the taste of the bitter bark to the sound of the tolling bell, has been woven into the very fabric of who you are today, a reminder that we are all but one bad harvest away from the same fundamental truths. This is the ultimate revelation that civilization is not a permanent achievement, but a continuous, fragile act of will against an indifferent horizon. The spatial geometry of the English landscape undergoes a radical, silent metamorphosis as the unsustainable nature of the old world dictates a new skeletal layout of existence. Walk through the periphery of what used to be a bustling market town and observe the texture of the abandoned perimeters. The stone walls are being reclaimed by the slow green violence of ivy, and the wooden fences that once marked the boundaries of private property have collapsed into the earth, no longer defended by the legal weight of a functional court system. You can feel the air becoming lighter, less crowded by the breath of thousands, yet heavier with the sensory density of a wilderness that is aggressively returning to claim its lost territory. Listen to the sound of the river. It is louder now, unrestrained by the silted mills that once choked its flow, a cold and rushing reminder that the infrastructure of man is a temporary guest on this damp island. The contrast between the rigid, overpopulated past and this sprawling, empty present is a physical sensation of openness that borders on the terrifying. You see the ruins of the common granary, its timber ribs exposed like the carcass of a great beast, providing a stark architectural metaphor for the gutting of the medieval social contract. The functional necessity of centralized living is dissolving. Families are retreating into deeper, more isolated pockets of the forest, seeking the primal security of the hidden rather than the exposed fragility of the village square. You feel the atmosphere of a kingdom that is being thinned out, like a garment worn until the threads are visible against the light. The organization of life is shifting from the communal to the atomic, where the only survival strategy is a nomadic alertness and a refusal to be anchored to a soil that can no longer guarantee life. You touch the surface of a discarded cartwheel, half buried in the mud, its iron rim cold and pitted with the relentless oxidation of a world that has stopped moving at its former pace. This is the structural reality of the Great Transition, a landscape that is breathing again, but only because the lungs of the population have been punctured by the unsustainable demands of their own expansion. The sensory decay has peaked and is now being replaced by a raw, unadorned purity. The smell of rain on stone, the sight of a horizon that no longer holds the promise of a welcoming hearth, the taste of cold, clear water that carries no trace of the village's waste. You are standing in the middle of a historical erasure, watching the ink of a century of growth being washed away by the tide of a brutal corrective reality. Every element of this spatial collapse, from the overgrown roads to the silent churches, is a lesson in the limits of human arrogance. The stability of the Old England was a house of cards built on the assumption of a static climate, and as you watch the fog roll in from the North Sea, obscuring the outlines of the dead manors, you realize that the only thing sustainable in this world is the capacity to truly endure the loss of everything you once called certain divine protection. Step through the heavy oak doors of a parish church in East Anglia and feel the change in the density of the air. It is no longer thick with the sweet, expensive smoke of frankincense, but heavy with the smell of damp limestone and the cold, metallic tang of rainwater pooling on the flagstones. You can hear the rhythmic, persistent drip of water falling from the vaulted ceiling where the lead has been stripped away, a sound that echoes like a slow beating heart in a body that is refusing to die but has forgotten how to live. Look at the texture of the frescoes on the walls. The vibrant ochres and azures that depicted the celestial hierarchy are now flaking away, leaving behind a jagged, pale plaster that looks like exposed bone. The functional necessity of the church as the mediator between the erratic heavens and the hungry earth is shattering as the people realize that no amount of tithing can stop the black rot in the wheat or the cooling of the sun. You see the contrast in the very light of the ship. It is no longer a warm, filtered glow through stained glass, but a harsh, gray intrusion through broken traceries that reveals the dust motes dancing in the void. This is the spiritual breaking point of the Middle Ages, where the organization of the cosmos, once thought to be as rigid as the stone pillars, is revealed to be as fragile as the breath of a starving child. You notice the silence of the choir, a space that once vibrated with the harmonic certainty of the Gregorian chant, now occupied only by the rustle of dry leaves blown in from the cemetery. The atmosphere is one of profound abandonment, not by the people, but by the very certainty that the old world was built upon. You feel the coldness of the baptismal font, its water frozen into a jagged, clouded disk, a sensory reminder that the rituals of life have been suspended by the brutal reality of survival. This is the transition from a society of faith to a society of observation, where the peasant looks at the stone saints not with hope, but with a weary, searching skepticism. The stability of the divine right is eroding. With every day, the grain bins remain empty, and the fragility of the religious infrastructure is laid bare, as the priests themselves succumb to the same fevers and hungers as the flock. You touch the cold, damp wood of the pulpit and realize that the words spoken here no longer have the power to feed the belly or warm the soul. This is the erasure of the medieval mind's anchor, a moment of terrifying liberation where the human spirit is forced to find its own meaning in a landscape that has grown indifferent to prayer. Every element of this crumbling sanctuary, from the cracked bells to the empty collection plates, is a testament to the fact that when a system becomes unsustainable, even the heavens are forced to go silent. The physiological unraveling of the human body becomes the final, most intimate map of an unsustainable civilization, where the very biology of the English people begins to rewrite itself under the pressure of the Great Famine. Walk among the spectral figures huddled in the lee of a collapsed stone wall and feel the shift in the sensory density of life. It is no longer defined by the heat of labor, but by a cold, metabolic stillness that tastes of copper and dry earth. You can smell the ketosis on the breath of the village, a sharp, fruity, and unsettling scent that signals the body is consuming its own essence to maintain the flickering flame of consciousness. Look at the texture of the skin on the hands of a weaver who no longer has wool to spin. It is translucent, stretched thin like aged parchment over knuckles that have become jagged islands of bone. The functional necessity of the muscles, once the pride of the English longbowman and the sturdy plowman, is dissolving, leaving behind a physical fragility that mirrors the structural collapse of the kingdom's roads and bridges. You notice the contrast in the eyes of the young. They are too large for their hollowed faces, burning with a feverish, predatory intensity that replaces the dull compliance of the feudal servant. This is the biological breaking point, where the organization of the human cell reaches its limit of deprivation, and the sensory world narrows down to the single rhythmic throb of a head that never subsides. The atmosphere is one of profound silent desperation, where the sound of the wind through the leafless oaks is louder than the voices of the people, for speaking has become an expensive luxury of energy they can no longer afford. You feel the grit of the gray, moldy bread in your own mouth, a substance that offers no satiety, only a dull ache in the gut and the lingering bitterness of the ergot fungus that brings dark, waking dreams to the starving mind. The stability of the seasons has been replaced by a chaotic biological winter that ignores the calendar, and the fragility of the social order is reflected in the way a father looks at his son's meager portion with a flicker of resentment that he immediately tries to smother. This is the transition from the human to the primal, where the thin veneer of chivalry and Christian charity is stripped away by the relentless rasp of an empty stomach. You touch the cold, damp wool of a discarded cloak and realize that the warmth it once provided was a byproduct of a surplus that has been bled dry by the cooling earth. Every element of this physical decay, from the loss of hair to the cessation of the hearth fire, is a testament to the fact that when the land stops providing, the body becomes its own final, desperate harvest. The organization of life is now a countdown of calories, a structural reality that no royal decree or priestly blessing can alter. As you watch the frost settle on the eyelashes of a sleeping child, you are witnessing the absolute limit of what a civilization can harden before it must either perish or transform into something entirely unrecognizable. The social architecture of the English manor house undergoes a terminal fractures as the unsustainable weight of the feudal hierarchy collapses under the sensory reality of a cold, empty hearth. Walk through the great hall where the Lord once sat in judgment and feel the immediate shift in the atmospheric density. It is no longer thick with the smell of roasting boar and the heat of 100 bodies, but permeated by the scent of damp wool and the sharp metallic tang of fear. You can hear the sound of the wind rattling the heavy oak shutters, a persistent, rhythmic thumping that sounds like a coffin lid being hammered into place over the corpse of the 13th century. Look at the texture of the tapestries hanging from the stone walls. They are heavy with moisture, the vibrant scenes of the hunt now obscured by a gray, creeping bloom of mildew that makes the hounds and the stags appear as ghostly, decomposing shadows. The functional necessity of the Lord's protection has evaporated, for his granaries are as empty as those of his serfs, and his knights are merely starving men in rusting armor who can no longer find the strength to lift a shield. You notice the contrast in the very light of the hall. It is a dim, watery gray that fails to illuminate the corners where the dust of neglected duties gathers in thick, velvety drifts. This is the structural breaking point of the nobility, where the organization of the land, once thought to be a divine mandate, is revealed as a fragile biological dependence on the sweat of men who are now too weak to stand. The atmosphere is one of profound, silent betrayal, where the servant looks at the master and sees not a protector, but a parasite on a dying host. You feel the coldness of the high table, its wood scarred by the knives of 1,000 feasts that will never return, a sensory reminder that the abundance of the past was a loan from a climate that has now declared bankruptcy. The stability of the lineage is eroding as the heirs succumb to the same wasting fevers as the peasants, and the fragility of the social order is laid bare when a lady of the house barters her silk gown for a bag of blighted oats. This is the transition from the courtly to the desperate, where the rules of etiquette are forgotten in the visceral scramble for the last candle or the last scrap of salted meat. You touch the cold iron ring of a torch holder and realize that the fire it once held was the light of a civilization that believed it had conquered the seasons. Every element of this crumbling authority, from the empty wineskins to the silent stables, is a testament to the fact that when a system becomes unsustainable, even the highest walls cannot keep out the brutal reality of a cooling world. The organization of the realm is dissolving into 1,000 local tragedies, a structural collapse that no law or lineage can halt. As you watch the Lord stare into the cold ashes of his fireplace, you are witnessing the end of an era that forgot that power is ultimately harvested from the soil, not granted by the crown.